And happy Monday, February 20th, 2023, and welcome to a President's Day edition of what I like to call the Isolation Cabin. I'm your host, the vegan you believe in, Kurt Cadet, in the flesh as always. And here on the Isolation Cabin, we discuss the many forms that isolation takes on, the consequences that come from it, and what you can eventually do to move past those issues and make it to a better place. So I want to talk to you guys today about the isolation that many of us felt from the COVID epidemic. I know it's been 3 years since that all went down. It's kind of hard to believe at times, but if there's anything that's contributed to people feeling more isolated and more alone than ever in these times, it was definitely that period. If I could describe that whole period, that whole frame of time in one word, that one word would be unprecedented. All of us were literally told not to leave our houses for weeks and even months at a time. And while the severity of COVID is serious and it is a real virus, I also at the same time can't ignore the negative effects that forced isolation period had on many of us, and those effects that we're probably still feeling today. Many of us couldn't go to work, we couldn't go to the gym, couldn't go to restaurants, movies, concerts, sporting events, couldn't do jack shit. And even if you're somebody who loves staying home all the time and doesn't like to go out much, even you yourself would have to admit that these circumstances were freaking extreme. And it's okay to admit that. And to be someone who was concerned about COVID and also concerned about the response to it and how it would negatively affect all of us. Because having all of those daily activities taken from you so suddenly, it's only natural to be shaken up by it. And without those daily activities and all those things to do, we were left with a lot of time to kill. And while that sometimes can be a good thing, specifically if you've been on the grind for a long time and if you've gone a long period of time without a break and without taking a breather, yes, it's a good thing to put everything on pause. But at the same time, having that amount of free time can cause a lot of issues and also cause a lot of unnecessary stress. With that amount of free time on your hands, you are easy prey for negative thoughts and negative feelings that you have no business giving the time of day to. Because if there's one thing I've learned from my past bouts of isolation, is that having that amount of free time can be very dangerous. When all of the things that kept you busy and kept you going in a sense are taken from you and you would just have nothing but time to think, sometimes what you think about are things that could drag you down a dark hole, because you could end up thinking about the past and all the things that didn't work out and things that you wish you had done differently and things you wish had worked out differently. Or you could start thinking about the future and dwelling on the future, about money issues, about health issues, about where you'll be a year from now, 6 months from now, and also the whole COVID thing and whether or not you'll catch COVID or die from COVID or somebody you know will die from COVID. Yeah, because with that amount of free time and nothing to devote that time to, as opposed to that, it becomes very easy to get sucked into those thoughts and consumed by those thoughts. And before you know it, all that shit really has a hold on you. And I know many of us at one point or another have suffered through that, and especially suffered through that when the whole COVID pandemic went down. And by that point when COVID had just started, I had just come off of finishing college the year before. I still didn't know what the future held, but I at least had some excitement for it and some hope for it in a sense. And then when all that stuff happened, I was left with even more uncertainty than I had before. And many of you out there, I'm sure, went through that same uncertainty and also same in disappointment in a sense, because I know many of us had plans, whether it be vacations, whether it be career goals or what have you, and a lot of those plans just got thrown out the window, out of nowhere, literally out of nowhere. No flights anywhere, no sporting events, no concerts. You literally couldn't do anything but sit at home. Unless you worked at the hospital or worked at the grocery store, yeah, those were pretty much all you had. And it was natural to become isolated, depressed, and cut off from the world in a sense. And hey, we had no control over that. That was all completely out of our hands. Nothing we could really do to fight it, and it was what it was. But unfortunately, even if it was for our safety, those negative consequences that came from COVID that I'm speaking of are real. And many people suffered from them and are still suffering from them. And also another thing that this whole COVID pandemic contributed to was keeping us divided. For one, we were isolated. We couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't hang out with loved ones, and we were encouraged not to, and we were encouraged to do the social distancing shit. But in addition to that, if that wasn't bad enough, we also became very divided with all the political and racial shit that was going on in the real world. From the George Floyd murder and the protests that sparked from that, and also the presidential election bullshit with the two crappy options we had. It kept everybody divided, it kept everybody fighting each other, and people more than ever went as far as to cut people off and stop associating and stop being friends with people who had opposing arguments and opposing views on these set issues. And also another issue they became divided about and fighting about was the whole COVID thing, about whether or not the response to it was right, whether or not you should wear a mask, whether or not COVID is real or not, or how serious it is, or the vaccine bullshit. All of that stuff during that entire period kept us all even more divided than we already were. And dealing with that COVID situation for as long as we did, I'm sure after a while a lot of people became cool with that whole situation and living that way and not going out and keeping people at a distance and also cutting people off that you disagreed with. Yeah, more than anything, that whole COVID thing just made people cool with being isolated and cool with not having any contact with the outside world. And hey, I'm not going to say there wasn't some pluses to it. I'm not going to say that there wasn't some good that came from putting everything on pause and taking a breather. But also deep down, I knew even at the time that way of life was definitely not sustainable long term. I said to myself, like when that whole thing first started, this whole thing is weird. This whole thing is unprecedented. I don't know what the fuck is going on. But as long as it's only temporary, cool. And then 1 month turned into 2 months, 2 months turned into 6 months, 6 months then turned into a year turned into mandatory vaccines, and then so and so. You get my drift. Yeah, and that was the thing. While there were many people that did suffer from COVID, there were also people that suffered from COVID that didn't catch the virus. And that's what I mean. There were people during that period who were suffering from the quarantine and suffering from the isolation and suffering from being stuck in their house, specifically when they're in a negative home situation, whether they have somebody who's abusing them, somebody they don't get along with. Yeah, being locked in the house for that amount of time with somebody you don't like or somebody who's fucking with you is not healthy and not sustainable. And that's one thing that kind of bothered me during the time when people would say that you're not stuck at home, you're safe at home. And I get what they were trying to imply, but considering those scenarios that I painted out about people in negative home situations and all that, you're not necessarily safe at home in that regard. Yeah, bro, that forced isolation during COVID, I know myself speaking for me, it definitely had a lot of negative consequences. And a lot of negative bullshit from the past definitely creeped up that I had no business even giving the amount of time and energy that I did. But if there's one good thing that came out of that whole ordeal is the fact that I survived it. I'm better off for it. I learned from it. And that I can use that experience to help out someone else who's going through that same experience that I did. Free time isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you have to be very careful about how much free time you have. And also what you do with it. And hey, I like binge watching shows and all that stuff as much as the next person, but even me myself, I know there's a cutoff time and there's a time where eventually I want to do something and eventually I want to not stay in the house. And I know it's been 3 years, but I'm sure people still are feeling the effects and the consequences of the whole pandemic and all the shutdowns and all that. But if I can make any suggestions how to make good use of that free time if you have no other choice, and to not let that negative bullshit and those negative thoughts consume you, please take a listen to these suggestions. First off, get up and move around. If there's one thing I've learned is that whenever I'm thinking about something negative or something like that pops up in my head, getting up, moving around, and doing something to keep my mind off of that will usually take away any power that it has. And as you spend more time doing something else and not thinking about that, as more time goes on, that thought will be a distant memory. And that thought will be the farthest thing from your mind. Whether it be exercising, whether it be calling somebody on the phone or cooking, anything along those lines, just find something else to do. Find something to keep your mind off that shit. Whatever it is, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it may seem on paper, just do that shit instead of thinking about that negative shit. You will thank yourself. Also, another thing I've learned to do is also write. Whether you journal, whether you like to write stories, write music. If there's one good thing I've learned from writing over the years is that it really helps in keeping the negative shit out of your head, and it's a healthy way of expressing it and getting out of your system. Yeah, because I've been writing music for 20 years and I've been writing stories for the last 3 or so years, and I studied journalism when I was in college. Writing has been a big part of my life. And also in many ways it's saved my life, believe it or not. In my opinion, it's probably one of the best forms of expression there is. No matter what you're writing about, no matter how you write, it's just a good way to get stuff off your chest in a way that nothing else can. And if there's one thing I'm grateful for, it's the fact that I've always been a good writer throughout my life. It's definitely gotten me a long way. It's definitely helped with my self-esteem and also help in keeping negative shit out of my head. And I think that if you exercise more of that into your life, you'll see a lot of good progress. Also, another thing you can do is be wary of the amount of time you spend on social media and also watching the news. Because I mentioned before that this whole COVID thing kept us divided and at each other's odds more than ever. And a big reason why was because of social media and also the news. Because through the news and also social media, you're exposed to round-the-clock coverage of negative stories, celebrity scandals, how many people died of COVID, what you need to be worried about, what you need to be scared of. And the more time you spend on that and the more time you spend putting your energy into that, the worse off you're going to be. And the more stressed out and unhappy you're going to be. Because there's a reason why the first story you see on the news is about a murder or something you need to be afraid of, something you need to be scared of. And hey, I'm not saying you shouldn't be informed and be wary of what's going on. But when you're consuming that much of it, and when the majority of it is negative bullshit that's just gonna scare you and make you afraid, then you're not doing yourself any favors. You're not doing yourself any good. You're not informing yourself. You're keeping yourself in fear. And that shit is not a good look. And I'm guilty of it too. I don't watch the news that much. Even though I study journalism, I don't watch the news that much because there's only very little of it I can take. But I am guilty of social media use and the abuse of it. I get that it's a part of our society today and it's pretty much inescapable. But if there's one thing I've learned is that being on that shit too much can definitely cause problems. Because one minute you might be looking at a happy story or a positive post or a funny meme, but then the next minute you'll see a story about somebody who has cancer or somebody whose pet died or something a politician said that you don't like. That shit is a rabbit hole. That shit is a huge rabbit hole. And like I said, I'm guilty of it too, but the amount of time you spend on that social media shit and the amount of attention you give it can definitely cause some problems and definitely lead to these issues of isolation and also the division that I've been speaking of. With the George Floyd stuff, the political stuff, it's definitely a way that keeps us divided and keeps us at odds with each other. And I'm not saying those issues aren't important, but at the end of the day, if it's not one of those issues, it's going to be something else. And you have to be very wary of that because all of these situations, all of these issues are more than anything else just a means of turning us all against each other. And that's a form of isolation I am not down for. Because I would rather focus my attention on the real bad guys as opposed to just random people on social media that I don't even know. Because at the end of the day, that's pretty much what they want you to do, is continue fighting each other, continue bickering with each other, continue being divided over everything. Because the more you stay focused on that, the less you stay focused on the other issues that are important. So yeah, just keep in mind of the social media and the news intake that you consume, because too much of that shit can definitely be poison. This is underrated, but this one's very important. Talk to someone. It could be a sibling, could be a parent, could be a significant other, could even be a therapist, which I also highly recommend. Whatever problems you're feeling, whatever issues you're facing, talk to someone. Talk to someone you know you can trust, and talk to someone you know who will not judge you. Those are very important to remember. Because you could talk to anybody, but they'll criticize you, they'll judge you, they'll gossip about you, and things along those lines. But make sure you can find someone to talk to about your issues that will listen, that will understand, and also, like I said, more than anything else, will not judge you for it. Because if there's one thing that helped me during the whole COVID thing, was going to therapy. I had never gone to therapy in my entire life. I always heard of it, but never really got around to doing it. But then once I actually started going on a regular basis, I realized it did me a lot of good. Good to get your feelings out and talk about certain things to someone who you know won't gossip about it to other people, and also someone you know you can be comfortable in saying those things to. Because, hey, there's a lot of things that, I would prefer maybe not to talk to my parents about, or to talk to a friend about, or things along those lines. And that's why talking to a therapist about it helped. And that's why it did me a lot of good and helped me make progress in my life. And I just hope that if you're going through a similar situation like I went through, that you'd be willing to get out of that comfort zone and go to it. Because I know it can be hard to open yourself up and also maybe talk about things you've been holding on to. But if you take that first step and then are consistent from that first step on, you'll be surprised at the person you become. I'm telling you, you'll be very surprised. And you'll be also surprised at the things you'll realize about both your past and your present behavior. You'll realize why certain things didn't work out, why you grew up, why you turned out the way you did, for better or worse. And then once you realize more of those things, you can take the necessary precautions to fix it, and also the necessary precautions to make a better version of yourself. Because I know that COVID shit did a lot of damage to us. I know it probably made us isolated in a way we haven't been before, and also in some ways people became too comfortable with that. But I'm here to say, there's a life out there. There's a life out there that's worth living, worth enjoying and experiencing. And you shouldn't cheat yourself out of that life just out of fear of COVID and fear of what might happen. And also you shouldn't cheat yourself out of it because you're too comfortable and too content with being isolated and being in your house all day. Because that way of life is nowheresville. It was cool for a little while. I did enjoy parts of the COVID pandemic, but I just knew deep down that that shit was not a way I wanted to live permanently. And I hope if you're listening to this and you're in that scenario, that you don't want to live your life that way permanently either. So please listen to these steps. Take them to heart, because on the other side of that isolation, the other side of that division, that other side of that quarantine life is a lot of good. And a lot of good, I promise you, you do not want to miss out on. So shed the negative bullshit. Don't give it the time of day. Don't become divided over issues you know at the end of the day aren't worth being divided over. And more than anything else, live your life. Because there's a good one out there for all of us to live. And it would be a shame if we let it go to waste. Hope you guys enjoyed my talk today. Hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. If you want to follow me on any of my social media pages, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, just follow me at my first and last name, Kirk Cadet. Send me a message, send me a holler. Tell me what you like about the show, what you don't like about the show. I'm going to be here for a long time to come, breaking you guys off about this isolation shit, the negative consequences it has on us, and the things we can do to fix it. and be better off for it. So until next time, this is Kirk Cadet for another edition of the Isolation Cabin, and I wish you guys the best. See you next week.